Welcome to my channel, Creative Photo Folk. I'm Hayley, photographer and artist, and I'm obsessed with teaching you all the creative techniques to transform your photos into art. In this week's editing tutorial, I'm going to show you how to use Photoshop to create the illusion of a folded page. So first, I'm going to demonstrate an easy way to use this technique on some regular photos, and then I'll show you how to use this technique to create a storytelling image. Now, in choosing the images to use this technique on, you want to kind of be thinking about juxtaposition. So maybe you're using an image where you want to show color and then black and white. Or you could use two images that aren't the same but are similar, like one might have a picture of trees and the other one might have a picture of cut down trees, for example. Or you could do two images that are shot at the exact same location and position but at different times of day, so day or night. So it's best to use this on something where it will make a little bit of sense. The other thing to be aware of is that what's peeking through on the page underneath needs to be interesting because that's where the eye will go. So make sure that whatever corner you're choosing to have your folded page, that whatever will be showing through from underneath is going to be interesting and not just a boring part of a scene, which often the corners are because we tend to put the subject sort of more central. So that's just something to be aware of. So first I'm going to show you a real easy version where we're going to take a color image and then convert it into black and white. So we've got a little bit of color peeking through. Now I did try the opposite and I didn't really like it as much. So this is what we're going to do with this scene. So let me teach you the base technique first of all. Firstly, you're going to want to open your image in Photoshop. Then you want to make a copy of it. So Control or Command J. Now this is if we're just using one image and, making a black and white version of it. I'll show you if you're using two different images in the next variation. Then you want to use the marquee tool, which is second down on your toolbar, and you want to hold that down and make sure rectangular marquee tool is chosen. And we're going just to make a selection of the corner a bit like this, sort of in a rectangle shape. Then we're going to add a new adjustment layer by going to this little icon here, the half pie, and we'll go to gradient, second from the top. We're going to drop down this little box, open up basics, hopefully yours looks like this, and choose black and white. Then we'll click off to get back to this box. We're going to make the angle -135. If you were on the other side, you would make it -45. So it really just depends on what angle you're working from. Then I'm going to hit OK. And what we're going to do now is, with this layer highlighted, we're going to Control or Command click the layer underneath it so they're both highlighted. And then we're going to right click and go to Merge Layers. So they are now one layer together. Now what we're going to do is go to Control or Command T, which brings up our transform tool. Then I'm going to right click and choose Warp. And I'm going to then pull this corner up far enough that we are not seeing the seam underneath it. Now I made mine a bit too big, which means my corner now is too big. That might be what you want. And you can see how that gradient layer has made a gradual toning from white to dark. So that is why we add that. Now I'm just going to do that again really quickly with a smaller marquee. And I wanted to show you that because it is an easy mistake to make. So we'll make it about there. We will add our gradient. We will merge them. And then when we warp, this should be a little bit easier. There we go. That's a nicer curl, I think. So now we've created our curl. And I mean, you could do this. You could just have the same image underneath. But what I'm going to do is make this top one black and white. So all I did was added a hue saturation adjustment layer, made sure that it was clipped to just the layer below it, not the one underneath. So I can do that with Alt or Option and then clicking between the layer and the layer underneath it. Or you can use this little box right here. And I just drag down the saturation. So that's how we got that one. Now you could do a little bit more work to it, but basically that's the easy version of this technique. Now I want to show you how to do this version, which is actually two different images. And I'm going to show you a few more advanced techniques if you want to make this a little bit more realistic. So basically what I did for this one, oh, it is the same image. I've just used different parts of that image. So I really loved the story of the dog's intensity at the ball. And so I wanted to do this in this kind of curl pattern. But I thought there was a lot of blank space in this image. And I also liked that the dog and the ball were positioned on corners, so that made it easy to have something in those corners like I talked about earlier. So basically I had the same image but twice. So I had a bit where the dog was in the corner and then where the ball was in the position I wanted it. So I did the exact same technique, this time from this corner, so the angle had to be slightly different, and curled that up. So I did do a couple of extra things to this image. The first one was to add a shadow under here to make it look a little bit more realistic. So on that layer which the curl was on, I basically double clicked it just in the blank spot part of the image. And then I added a drop shadow. So you actually need to clip on the box drop shadow. And then I played with my settings to get something I liked. So I want the opacity a little bit higher there. The distance is just how far out extends. Spread is more about softness, and then the size of it. So I think that looks kind of cool. So I'm going to hit OK. Now I wanted to give it a little bit more dimension by putting a shadow under the curve itself. And this was actually a little bit tricky. What I had to do was make a selection of this and then pop it onto a new layer so I could add a shadow underneath it. So this is entirely up to you because it is a little bit time consuming. So I've tried a few tools and I find that the quick selection tool is best. So it is fourth down and then you hold that down and click quick selection. And we can just click in, and that did a pretty good job. It's just kind of missed the corners a little bit. So I'm just going to make it really small using my square bracket keys and hold down Shift to say I want to add to this selection and just paint a tiny bit more in. That might do it. So now that we've got that selection loaded, I want to make sure that my layer that has that curl on, so our main layer, is highlighted. And I'm going to press Ctrl or Command J. So that curl is now on a layer by itself. Now it did bring the drop shadow with it, so I'm just going to right click and clear layer style on that particular one, not the one underneath. Now what I'm going to do is press Ctrl or Command click to load that selection again, and I'm going to add a new layer with my new layer button. I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, making sure that black is in Contents. Great, I'm going to press Ctrl or Command D to deselect, and now I'm just going to drag that black layer underneath the curl layer we just created. Perfect. And I'm also going to turn back on our main layer as well. Now I'm going to go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And so that has now given us a little bit of a curl, and we can change that based on how blurry we actually want it. I think maybe 66 is pretty good. Now I didn't like how it added some extra shadow where we've already created one, so I just added a layer mask with the little rectangle and a hole in it. I'm going to load my brush tool with B. I'm going to make that quite small, making sure that black is loaded as my color swatch. And I'm just going to paint, oops, my flow is down. Paint all that extra, just be careful at those edges, extra bit that I added away. And if I want, I can drag down the opacity of that up here just by putting my cursor over it and dragging it down. So it's a little more subtle. So that is how that one is created. Now finally, and this is totally optional, but I don't really like how the paper just looks really plain. So what you can do is you can go to Window, Patterns. If you don't see anything here, you can click this little right-hand menu button, hamburger button, and click Legacy Patterns and More, which will load this in. And we can have a look through here to choose what we want. So I went into Art of Surfaces and chose watercolor just to give that a little bit of a texture. That has actually clipped automatically. So if it's not, you could Alt or Option click so it's just affecting that curl layer you created. And then I can just drag down the opacity on that. And you want to change the blend mode on that to multiply so that you get back that gradient underneath. But now you've got a little bit of texture on it. So let me show you, zoomed in, before and after. So I kind of like that. That's something you might want to try. I think these shadows are a little bit too much. I just want to make them a bit more subtle. Now, if this drop shadow is too much for you, you can double click on it and play with the settings again. But a much quicker way is I like to right click it and then you can say create layer. What that does is, you'll hit OK. It makes that drop shadow its own layer. So it's now not attached to this. And that means that you can actually play with the opacity if you want. And so I can make that a little bit subtler. So that's a little handy trick to know. So next I wanted to create an artwork variation of this along the style of art that I like to create. So I had this technique in mind when I shot this pose, and I knew that I wanted her to be pulling down a corner and revealing something behind. I didn't know at the time what that'd be, but I ended up playing with some photos of the Milky Way. This was a little bit harder to create because where we make the rectangle and the gradient, it doesn't work on a square image. And I will show you that actually. And so this was quite a bit more complicated to create, but let's have a little look through our layers. The initial image that I shot looked like this. I do not know why it has spots on it. But anyway, so it had a big tree here that I wanted to get rid of. So I actually ended up having to replace the sky. So I put a new sky behind it and then masked away all the bits I didn't want to include. So I made a selection of her and made a selection of the mountains and then popped the sky behind. However, there was still some issues with this tree. You won't have these. Basically, I just had to clone that tree out. Now, let's say we're working with this image, which presumably you would think that the easiest way would now be to apply what we've done before, and that is to get the rectangular marquee tool, make a selection, add that gradient with the gradient tool, make that black and white. I wish I remembered what was last used. In this case, we will need 45 degrees. Then we'd have to merge those layers. And if I now try to curl it, especially to that area, that's okay, but I really didn't like how the platform is now wonky. I just didn't like that. It doesn't work for me. Also, because it is a larger image than a rectangle, we had some areas in the corners. It took a lot of drawing of that gradient to get it right. So it didn't end up working for me. So if you are in the same boat and your gradient isn't working, then I had to find another way around that. So what I had to do instead is I selected just the top half of the image and made a duplicate of that, making sure that none of the bottom was selected, and that is the bit I curled. So then I could turn on the underneath layer, and that's how that looked. So we now don't have as much of that distortion that we had before. Now, because I actually wanted a different thing behind this, I had to bring that layer in. So it is just in the layer stack under that curl that we created. Then, as before, I added that little layer shadow in behind the curl. Now, one thing you might notice here is the page isn't white, and that's because I didn't add the gradient, and that's what happens without the gradient. So without making that kind of marquee selection and then filling it with a gradient, this is what happens without it, and you might prefer that. So let me just show you what I mean. This is that image we were working on before. Without making a selection or adding the gradient, I can just press Ctrl or Command T, right click, hit warp, pull that up. And then what was on this side now comes on this side. So I could have the ball kind of there. It just looks a bit stretchy and gross, but that could be something you want to play with. So anyway, back in our main file, I didn't want this on the other side. So I decided to make things super complicated on myself, and I just made a selection of this little curl. With that selection active, I basically copied the Milky Way layer onto its own layer. Then I added this as a layer mask, so it was just contained into that area where there was a fold. And then I moved the bit of Milky Way around so that it looked a little bit different from what we had before. Now what is missing is the curl shadow. So I, again, when I had that selected, made a black fill, blurred it up, brought down the opacity. And then I just added a bunch of toning to make it a little bit different, draw the eye to her rather than everywhere else in the scene. So it's a little bit more advanced, and I don't really expect you to understand what I just explained, but I just wanted to show you that there are more advanced options that you can use here. So I think this image still needs a little bit of editing, but you get the idea of what I was wanting to achieve here, if that's something that you want to play around with. So I hope you like this technique and are keen to try it out. If you do, come and share your results in our Facebook group, which you'll find linked below. Otherwise, I'll see you again next week with more creative photography tutorials. Wishing you a happy day of creating. See ya!